A Nimrod is on patrol, keeping the vast coastal waters of the British Isles under surveillance in order to keep the sea lanes open. For up to 12 hours at a time, this huge aircraft can cruise at 500 miles per hour, using its search water radar system to pinpoint any potential hostile activity. It is the eyes and ears of the Royal Air Force. In the early 1900s, Britain had one of the most powerful navies in the world, protecting her interests at home and throughout the empire. Flying was seen as nothing more than a rich man's sport and of no interest to the navy. Besides, the English Channel was the finest form of natural defense. Then, in June 1909, Louis Blériot took around 40 minutes to fly across the Channel in an aeroplane he had designed and built himself. Now the Royal Navy, and indeed the Army, began to take notice. Naval concerns were to be increased by the development of the submarine. They called it underhand, unfair, and un-English. But the submarine was here to stay. Then it was realized that it was easier to spot a submarine from the air than from sea level. Soon, a number of naval officers were learning to fly. In 1911, the first naval flying school opened. The Army had also begun to see military uses for aircraft, and in 1912, the Naval and Army flying units were combined to form the Royal Flying Corps. The idea was to cut the cost of training and equipment, but the services couldn't agree on who did what, nor which aircraft they should be using, or how pilots should be trained.
And as a seaplane pilot, one had to be very much better trained in navigation and in various other requirements related to the water. Having said that, I can only say that I did enjoy flying seaplanes and spent most of my time flying over the southern North Sea. Navigation, of course, was essential because very quickly after one became airborne, one was out of sight of land or any sea marks. So the use of compass bearings and timing and wind direction were vital to plotting your course and getting home eventually.
Within 2 years, the Admiralty had created its own Air Force, the Royal Naval Air Service. As a result, when the First World War broke out, Britain had not only one, but 2 air services. During the first years of the war, the Navy searched hard for a role for its aircraft. At first, recognizing that Britain's ports could be vulnerable to attack by airships, they felt they needed the protection of fighters. But the first German Zeppelin raids of the war proved that the aircraft of the time just couldn't fly high enough to attack the Zeppelins. So the RNAS began to look at ways of turning its aircraft into bombers, to attack the Zeppelins in their sheds and prevent them ever getting airborne. To do the job properly, however, a new aircraft was needed, one that could carry a big enough payload of bombs. The handy Page 0100 and later the 0400 provided the solution.
The handy Page came along and increased the scope for night bombing enormously. It could carry more bombs, for one thing. Needed more crew, needed a crew of 4 as a minimum, but it was a big, stable aeroplane, and as there wasn't very much effective defense, people got away with it by flying handy Pages.
But many people wondered whether bombing targets well inside Germany was really practical, or considering the likely civilian casualties that would result, desirable. 2 years later, in 1917, Germany resumed her bombing campaign against London, this time using her own long-range bombers, and the moral doubts about bombing were swept aside in a tidal wave of public outcry. Within months, the two services were merged into one independent force. And on April the 1st, 1918, the Royal Air Force was born. At a stroke, the Navy lost control of nearly 3,000 aircraft, plus 55,000 officers and naval ratings. They were left with only their shipborne aircraft, and even these were to go to the RAF 2 years later. For almost 20 years, the Navy made repeated attempts to regain control over their aircraft. They seemed to be getting somewhere in 1924, when the Fleet Air Arm of the RAF was formed. It was agreed that so-called fleet flights, normally controlled by the RAF, would be given over to the Navy when they were flown from aircraft carriers. Apart from this, maritime aviation suffered from government underfunding, always losing out to the bombers. There were, of course, some new maritime aircraft. Manufacturers, who had developed a relationship with the Navy during the war, continued to build for the RAF, although in much smaller numbers. The Supermarine Southampton virtually saved the concept of the flying boat from extinction after a number of expensive failures.
You get out on the wing and put a starting handle into a cog as you did ancient motor cars and turn it round to start up the engines and climb back aboard again. And open cockpits too in the Southampton. Yeah, fine, solid aeroplane.
Its day-to-day role was reconnaissance of Britain's coastline, but it was most famous for its long-distance flights. In 1927, 4 Southamptons went on a flag-waving 27,000-mile trip around the Mediterranean and the Far East. Blackburn was another major supplier of flying boats. The Iris was an enormous 3-engine flying boat with a range of up to 500 miles. It had all the comforts of home, with sleeping accommodation, kitchen, and canteen for the crew, while on long-range reconnaissance missions. Blackburn also built a number of land or carrier-based torpedo bombers for the fleet flights. The Dart was the first, entering service in 1923. Its top speed was only 107 miles an hour, but its landing speed of around 38 miles an hour made it a natural choice for aircraft carrier use. The Ripon, introduced in 1929, was the natural successor to the Dart, and it set the standard for British torpedo bombers until the arrival of the Beaufort in 1939. The poor level of maritime development can be seen by the fact that the Fairey Swordfish, which became the Fleet Air Arm standard torpedo bomber of the Second World War, had a performance little better than that of the Ripon. In 1934, Winston Churchill warned of the growing power of Hitler's Germany, and finally defense expenditure began to increase. But as priorities moved backwards and forwards between bombers and fighters, naval requirements tended to get lost in the rush. In 1936, as part of a wholesale restructuring of RAF organization, the old coastal area was renamed Coastal Command. Only one area saw any expansion, and that was the Fleet Air Arm. The rest of the command had to struggle on with its obsolete biplanes. Indeed, the last biplane flying boat, the Supermarine Stranraer, didn't come into service until the following year.
I was very fond of the Stranraer, actually. Really good aeroplane, very, very solid. And I took the squadron out for cruises. We used to do what we called a med cruise. We used to go out to land at Lisbon, which is a bit hairy, as a matter of fact, because the Tigers seems to run very fast, and the buoys we had to tie up to were large metal ones, not the rather nice rubber ones which we've been used to. And if you had made a mistake on approaching your metal buoy, you could either take your float off or take a wing off or do a lot of damage.
In 1937, the Royal Navy had one final go at taking over the fleet air arm. This time, they won. RAF Coastal Command was left with only the land-based squadrons and a few flying boats at their disposal. The theory behind the virtual starvation of Coastal Command's development was that German surface ships seen as the principal threat could be dealt with by the Navy. Therefore, Coastal Command's aircraft would be used purely for reconnaissance. By 1939, it would become clear that most of Coastal Command's aircraft were unfit for the tasks ahead, and that their offensive weapons were totally unsuitable for attack. Some new aircraft and weapons were on the way. The majestic Sunderland, developed from an Imperial Airways C-class flying boat, added a strong long-range anti-submarine capability. And in 1939, the Lockheed Hudson was bought from America to bolster the command's offensive capability. Even so, Coastal Command entered the war woefully short of aircraft. At the outbreak of war, Coastal Command had only 19 squadrons. Some were receiving newer Sunderlands and Hudsons, but most were equipped with aging Avro Ansons, soon to be taken out of frontline duties.
There's an old lady which waddled along and could take you from A to B, but other than that, I don't think it served any useful purpose once the war had started. Anything which could only carry a 100-pound AS bomb wouldn't do any harm really to a submarine, which is his main target, I suppose. And when it came to dropping it on any land base, it was just putting pilots at risk unnecessary. Too slow, too fragile, in fact quite useless.
Coastal Command had to be reinforced with aircraft from other commands. Bomber Command supplied Wellingtons fitted with huge magnetic rings to explode German mines laid in the approaches to ports. They also supplied Handley Page Hamden light bombers in the early months of the war. Then, a whole range of heavy bombers were diverted from their main role in order to carry out attacks on enemy ships. Probably the best known of the stopgap aircraft was the Bristol Blenheim. Originally conceived as a light bomber in the mid-30s, the Blenheim was already virtually obsolete by the outbreak of war. Heavy losses of Blenheims in early raids and during the German invasion of France somewhat overshadowed the sterling role they played in spearheading Bomber Command's fight back after the dark days of almost constant defeat. In February 1940, Blenheim Mark IV fighters were transferred from Fighter Command to help with convoy and fishing fleet protection. They were followed by Blenheim IV bombers used for daylight raids on Channel shipping. They pressed home their attacks at mast height, braving the flak to drop their bombs almost horizontally.
In fact, when you attacked shipping, you flew towards the ships below the decks height of the ship. You pulled up over the mast to toss the bomb into the side of the ship, and it had 11 seconds delay, which enabled you to be about 1,000 yards away when it burst. It was no good dropping it on top of the ship because it would just bounce off, and the fuse didn't go off for another 11 seconds. So you had to fly very low, pull up over the mast, and push down the other side.
The bravery of the Blenheim crews cannot be underrated. They never faltered in their duty, however difficult the target. But unescorted as they usually were, they often fell prey to marauding German fighters. At 0 feet, they had no room to maneuver, and they hadn't the speed to run away. Britain had always relied heavily on the sea lanes to bring supplies from all over the world. Now, isolated from Europe, she was almost entirely dependent on the convoys coming from America. If these routes weren't kept open, the Second World War would inevitably be lost.
It became obvious when the Battle of the Atlantic started that we, quite apart from the bomber campaign that hadn't really got off the ground at this stage, we would possibly lose the war because we would be asphyxiated. Our supplies would be interdicted. We would not get the supplies necessary to sustain life. I mean, essentially, it was the siege of the United Kingdom. I mean, this is just like the same sort of old battle that you see in the Middle Ages, you know, of laying siege to an enemy fortress. We were going to be starved out. Not only could we not fight because we'd run out of war material, we would also essentially starve our population. And ultimately, that would have been quite persuasive, I suspect. So at that point, it was clear that the RAF was going to have to contribute more and more and more to success in the Atlantic.
Throughout the war, convoys to and from the USA, Russia, Canada, and other far-flung outposts of the British Empire had to be defended from enemy attack. The Germans attacked the Atlantic convoys from above and below. And Coastal Command, working closely with the Navy, was at the center of the struggle.
When we were on convoys doing, you had a creeping line ahead of the convoy where you went out about 5 miles and you turned 45 degrees starboard at right angles to the track you were heading in originally over the convoy, and then back to the convoy, and you did that all day. Now and again you do talked about the single aircraft, and normally a single aircraft on convoy in those days. Aircraft were pretty scarce, and we'd occasionally do a circuit round the convoy, and then back on this pattern again. And occasionally you go down the rear of the convoy and go a few miles behind, because the submarines used to chase these things all day and then attack them at night.
From the very first days of the war, German U-boats and surface raiders prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and strangling Britain's lifeline to the outside world. In the first 3 weeks alone, almost 150,000 tons of shipping was sunk. Yet Coastal Command had no effective weapon to counter the problem. Standing patrols kept watch on German ports, and when a U-boat was sighted, Bomber Command would send aircraft to attack. Invariably, they were too late. The problem grew more acute after June 1940, when the German capture of French Channel ports gave them a much shorter route into the South Atlantic. The Sunderland was the one aircraft with the range to patrol more than 500 miles from shore. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, and it bristled with so many machine guns that the Germans called it the Flying Porcupine. But there were never enough Sunderlands to cover the vast expanse of the Atlantic. In March 41, the Sunderlands were joined by an American-built flying boat, the Consolidated Catalina. The Catalina had earned a reputation in the US Navy for rugged reliability and impressive endurance. Together, the Sunderlands and Catalinas patrolled a wide area from the frozen North Atlantic areas around Iceland to the warmer climates of the West African coast. However, the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean meant that there was a gap beyond the range of Coastal Command aircraft. It became a rich hunting ground for U-boats. An even more powerful aircraft was needed to bridge the gap. The Liberator was the perfect solution. Another aircraft from the Consolidated Corporation, built as a heavy bomber, the Liberator entered service in June 1941 and immediately revolutionized Britain's defensive patrols. Flying mainly from bases in Northern Ireland, Liberators could range 2,000 miles from British shores, massively extending convoy protection. Coastal Command was playing a vital and decisive part in the Battle of the Atlantic. But life for the air crew could be very tedious. Patrols lasted for many hours, often flying over heavy seas and bad weather, and a lone U-boat was a difficult target to spot. Despite the tedium of mile after mile of empty water, they struggled to keep alert, and when a U-boat was spotted, they had to act fast before it submerged.
They were difficult things to find. You can imagine, in a rough sea in particular, and mostly the Atlantic was, the surf was broken one way or another. When you spotted them, they're well ahead of you. Well, not ahead of you, but they were, normally you spotted them ahead, of course. And they'd obviously seen you, and they were on the way down. By the time you got to the spot, they'd gone. And with a broken sea, of course, no hope of seeing them beneath the surface. Anyhow, the Atlantic's a pretty mucky bit of water anyhow, and even in the best of conditions, the visibility down through the water was practically non-existent. The one I spotted him, and I got to him before he had gone down, and I didn't know where he was. I dropped my stick of 450-pound naval depth charge on where I thought it was, and hung around for a bit, and nothing happened, and went on with my patrol. And the next day, an RAF aircraft was out there in the same area, and there was a submarine sitting on the surface, which they credited me with one that I'd damaged.
The bombs were too small, which meant that the chances of making a successful attack were reduced. In the first 2 years of the war, 245 attacks brought about only one confirmed U-boat destroyed, one surrendered, and 12 damaged. It was not until 1943 that specialist radar and better bombs reached the squadrons in sufficient quantities to improve their hit rate. All this time, however, the crews had to be on the lookout for enemy aircraft on long-range patrols.
Glassy, calm day, no wind, of course, and I was flying eastwards on this search. We're looking for submarines, of course. So anyhow, I was flying along, and one of the crew members spotted this thing behind us, the West airplane, and the visibility was good, and it turned towards us. It was quite a long way away. It must have been 20, 30 miles away. And the technique in those days was going to be attacked was to get down on the water as low as possible, so the enemy aircraft couldn't get underneath you, and also the fighters diving at you, they just as like to forget their height and go straight in, which happened quite a few times. I was hurtling along the water because it put on quite a bit of power, which didn't get me anywhere because all the built-in headwinds of a Sunderland, a lot of power didn't mean a lot of difference really. And this aircraft attacked, stood out of our range because it had cannon. We had 303s, which were useless really unless you got the airplanes close in. And the bullets were hitting the starboard main plane, and the surplus ones were coming over the top and hitting the water alongside me when the water was boiling with these cannon shells hitting. It felt a little bit uncomfortable really, you know, because we didn't have any armour plate or anything like that. So I whacked the power off the Sunderland and almost stood in its tracks. And what happened down behind, because the navigator was giving me a rough description of what was going on as well as advising the guns, we held our fire, apparently, until he was a wingspan away from us. And he came right in, he couldn't stop himself. And the tail gun put 2,000 rounds into him at that range, and then the navigator said, well, you can break starboard now. He's broken off, and he's round that way. So I turned starboard, and that was my first glimpse of him, really. And he was well and truly alight.
Until this time, the Sunderlands had been effective only in denying the U-boats time enough on the surface to aim their torpedoes at their intended victim. Now, better equipped, they actually began to sink the U-boats. Increased U-boat losses from this point persuaded the Germans to withdraw them from the North Atlantic to an area south of the Azores. Never again would they pose such a great threat to Britain's lifeline. As 1943 was a turning point for the struggle against the U-boats, so it was for the war waged by the strike aircraft against shipping. Early attacks on the Channel and the North Sea had been carried out by torpedo-carrying Bristol Beauforts and the American Hudsons. Both aircraft had had some success. But because of its lack of speed and maneuverability, the Beaufort in particular had suffered unacceptable losses. The Beaufighter from the same stable proved to be a very successful night fighter and was now used to solve Coastal Command's strike problem. Armed with a lethal cocktail of rockets, torpedoes and cannon, the Beaufighter revealed what a fast, heavily armed aircraft could do against even well-defended enemy convoys. And with fighter versions acting as escort against marauding German fighters, the strike wings had finally found success. The arrival of Mosquitoes and the strike wings was more good news. These versatile aircraft had already proved their effectiveness in the other commands, and now added their power and speed to anti-shipping sorties. Coastal Command was to play a pivotal role in the Allied invasion of Europe. By the summer of 1944, the command had grown to 71 squadrons, ready to protect the massive invasion fleet gathered in the ports all over the south of England. D-Day was imminent. After the Normandy landings, U-boats tried to get in among the fleet, but were generally weeded out by the big patrol aircraft. In July alone, Beaufighters made 500 separate attacks, sinking 22 German ships, 10 of them in a single convoy. The German Navy was virtually imprisoned in their ports. The invasion had deprived the few remaining U-boats of their French ports, and the Coastal Command strike wings held sway over all surface shipping. Throughout the war, probably the single biggest problem for the RAF was the loss of experienced aircrew. Flying from bases on lakes all around the British Isles, Coastal Command made every effort to save those shot down over the sea. The success rate was already 1 in 3, but better organization could improve even this figure. In June 1941, control of air-sea rescue services was handed over to Coastal Command. It is hard to imagine the pilots' fears, shot down, possibly wounded and floating far from shore. The sea would have been bitterly cold, with the prospect of the weather turning bad. Imagine his relief when from over the horizon came the aircraft that would save his life. The pilot would have to brave heavy seas to land and taxi towards it. There'd be no time to waste, as enemy fighters would be nearby, and the aircraft would be a sitting duck. The cold, soaking pilot would have been quickly plucked from the water so that the aircraft could immediately take off again. Another pilot rescued. Over 10,000 people were picked up by the air-sea rescue squadrons during the war, and every single such rescue boasted the morale of all involved. One of the most famous rescue aircraft was the little supermarine walrus amphibian, or Shagbat, as it was affectionately known. Designed as a catapult aircraft for use on battleships, it entered service in 1936. Its new life in Coastal Command air-sea rescue squadrons began 5 years later.
The trouble with the walrus was that it was designed in about 1920, and it would have faded away but for the war. It was a very strongly built amphibian, which was meant to have a crew of 3. And when you even flew with a crew of 2 and landed and picked up 8 Americans, because they were always the heaviest, they were big chaps, clad in lots of clothing which was soaking wet. And by the time they got onto the airplane, you had to shut the windows, stop the sea coming in, because you literally only had 18 inches above the surface before you came to the window. And with all these 10 people on board, I remember trying to take off once like that, and I got as far full throttle for about 10 minutes, and I was doing 4 knots. And eventually we taxied all night and were picked up by a boat, by a motor gunboat who transferred all the Americans on. And then I couldn't take off because I was so full of water. So we taxied on into England with some fuel brought over. Very wet, very cold, not dangerous, but we had lots of fun.
Later, the walrus was replaced by the sea otter, a longer range version, the last biplane ever to see service with the RAF. Air-sea rescues continued after the war. The remaining flying boats and amphibians continued to work together with marine launches until the first air-sea rescue helicopters arrived in the mid-50s. The ability of the helicopters to hover literally added a new dimension to rescue activities. And despite their principal service role, the all-yellow Westland Whirlwinds and Wessex became a familiar sight, rescuing civilians from the sea, cliff faces, and from other inaccessible places.
I think there is a belief in any form of warfare that you want to have a safety net, that you are prepared to commit yourself and fight to the utmost if you feel that somebody will come and pick you up if you are wounded or if you are downed in your aircraft. And I think that's an important psychological tool, a psychological reinforcement of your own position. So before you go into war, you think, yes, I will be picked up. And it's important that people do realize that that is there, and people will therefore feel remotivated as a result of it.
The post-war period brought new challenges for Coastal Command. And in line with the rest of the RAF, substantial cuts reduced the force to a shadow of its former self. The long-range liberators that had done such a sterling job over the Atlantic were returned to America under the terms of the Lend-Lease Agreement. So too went the Catalinas, leaving a glaring gap in anti-submarine capabilities. With no new replacements in the offing, the Sunderland was expected to soldier on for the foreseeable future. The only new arrivals were a number of converted Lancasters, which at least had the operating radius to help with reconnaissance duties. By 1950, it was obvious that the short-lived peace could come to a dramatic end at any time. The Soviet Union was rearming at an alarming rate. and the Berlin blockade had proved once again that they were prepared to back their communist ideals with force. Known Soviet expansion plans included the building of a substantial surface and submarine fleet. For this reason, therefore, the role of RAF Coastal Command was at the top of the defense agenda. During the setting up of NATO, it was agreed that Britain's responsibilities would include the provision of more forces in the Eastern Atlantic. This inevitably meant more aircraft, and arrangements were made to bring in a number of Lockheed Neptune medium-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft from the United States. What the Neptune lacked in performance was made up for with strong search and attack radar systems. It proved to be a worthy stopgap aircraft until new British designs were available. Throughout the post-war years, the RAF was regularly called on to help out in a number of localized conflicts around the world. 2 squadrons of Sunderlands played an important reconnaissance role during the Malayan emergency as part of a substantial RAF force. Communist guerrillas, originally armed by the British during the war, were now supported by a large community of Chinese sympathizers in their struggle for independence. The emergency lasted until 1960, tying up scarce RAF resources that would have been welcome in the defense of Europe. The proof that the RAF was stretched to the limit was their minor role in the Korean War. The same squadrons of Sunderlands now became Britain's only contribution to the conflict, giving support to the United Nations forces. They flew more than 1,000 missions, amassing thousands of flying hours while helping to blockade North Korean ports. But by the 1950s, the age of the flying boat was finally over. There has never been a better example of classic design and adaptability in the RAF than the Sunderland. Throughout its 20 years of service, it had performed magnificently on every task it was given, and they were many and varied. During the war, liberators had proved that long-range land planes could be as effective as flying boats at maritime patrol. On these grounds, the obvious replacement for the Sunderland was the Avro Shackleton. When the Shackleton entered service in 1951, it had been in development for some years. Now, new navigation and radar equipment had to be tested, and then there was a long period of retraining for the crews. But the aircraft passed all the tests with flying colors, except one. One of the distinctive features of the Shackleton was the roar of its Rolls-Royce Griffon engines. It was a sound that stirred the hearts of the British public, bringing back memories of the Griffon engine Spitfires of the war. But that inspiring noise did little for the crews, who had to spend up to 22 hours on each patrol listening to it, which, some ineffective muffling apart, they did for the next 40 years. In 1957, a defense white paper made huge cuts in the RAF as a whole, but Coastal Command came out of it better than most.
The lesson of trying to asphyxiate the supply lines to Europe was not lost on the Russians, who bought themselves vast submarine fleets. And it's perfectly clear during the late 40s and the 50s that the West was going to have to do something to stop the submarines from being deployed. Now, to the north of Britain, there is a gap, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, called the Griuk Gap. And all Soviet submarines, virtually all Soviet submarines, had to deploy through that gap. And so it became clear that the aircraft, by being used at long range, could possibly close that gap to the submarines and therefore prevent them moving out into the mid-Atlantic area. But there was a weakness, of course, in submarine design at the time, and that was that they were all conventional submarines. And what I mean by that is that they required diesels and batteries to actually provide the power. The diesels would be used to recharge the batteries, and then the batteries could be used for quiet running underneath the water without the use of air. But because they were battery powered, they had, of course, to come to the surface to get air to recharge the batteries from the diesels. Now, while they came to the surface, they used snorkels, and the snorkels were capable of being detected by the radars on aircraft. And so you saw in this period an era in which the aircraft using a radar device could spot a submarine snorting on the surface and go and attack it very quickly and effectively.
The continued build-up of the Soviet fleet had shown the government that a strong maritime defense force was vital. With the added strike capability of a newly developed homing torpedo, the Shackleton was an important part of NATO's plans. Nevertheless, the demise of the Sunderland and the planned phasing out of the Neptune would leave the Shackleton as the only fixed-wing aircraft in the command. There were just 10 squadrons of Shackletons to take on all the maritime responsibilities. They patrolled the Atlantic. They took part in combined exercises with the Navy and the US Air Force. And 3 of the 10 squadrons were permanently tied up in the Mediterranean to counter the growing Soviet presence. One squadron even took on a bombing role, dropping over 300 tons of bombs on Oman in 1958. This diversity of roles continued throughout the 1960s, until the Shackleton had well outlasted its intended life. By 1969, each of these old piston-engined aircraft had flown thousands of hours, and it was time to replace them with a more modern jet aircraft. The old command had also outlived its usefulness, being merged into Strike Command in 1969. It was replaced with the newly designated 18 Group. It seemed that everything was going to change under the new system, but the Shackleton wasn't going to be killed off that easily. In the early 1970s, the RAF was a tight-knit, slimmed-down force. Flexibility of response was the order of the day. But there was one glaring gap in the RAF's arsenal. They had no airborne early warning aircraft to locate incoming intruders. The 1957 cuts had foreseen the demise of the aircraft carrier as a weapon of war. The carrier fleet was disbanded, and their Fairey Gannet airborne early warning aircraft went with them. The planned early warning Nimrod had not yet taken off from the drawing board. In the interim, the RAF turned again to the good old Shackleton. In 1972, a new Shackleton squadron was formed with 12 aircraft to work up this AEW concept. Now these 20-year-old aircraft were fitted with forests of antennae and sported a new bulge under the nose to carry the radar. The old workhorse had learned new tricks and was carrying out one of the RAF's most important jobs. Their state-of-the-art radar could spot potentially hostile intruders many miles away. They would vector air defense fighters to an intercept and watch them carry it out on the screens. These old-timers found themselves working with the Phantoms brought in to bolster the strike capability. In the mid-70s, they went on sorties over the North Sea and the Atlantic, controlling the latest arrivals to the RAF's tactical arm. The Shackleton had returned from extinction to be at the forefront of operations. After 5 years, what was intended to be a temporary arrangement until the Nimrod AEW was ready was still going strong. In 1986, it was decided not to use Nimrods in this role at all. Instead, an American aircraft, the Boeing Sentry E-3D, was ordered. Finally, the Shackletons were scrapped. The 12 AEW variants had performed 38 years of service, 18 as maritime patrollers and 20 in their reincarnated role, an aviation record which will probably never be beaten. In fact, the RAF had received its first maritime reconnaissance Nimrods back in 1969. Developed from civilian de Havilland comets, the Nimrod reflected the very latest in technology and was the first 4-jet maritime reconnaissance aircraft to enter service with any of the world's air forces. These new aircraft gave the RAF a much improved range and endurance. At more than 1,000 miles from its home base, the Nimrod could spend 6 hours on patrol in the danger area. From 1980, uprated Mark IIs began to arrive with the vastly superior EMI Searchwater long-range radar, generally regarded as the finest system in the world. It was the Falklands War in 1982 that turned the Nimrod into a powerful force. Sidewinder missiles were added for self-defense. They were followed by the destructive Harpoon anti-shipping missiles capable of being launched from a range of 75 miles. For 20 years, Nimrods have patrolled the Iceland-UK gap and the western approaches with consummate skill. Its surveillance capabilities ensured early warning of any Soviet shipping and submarines. Since the Soviet threat has diminished, the Nimrods are still employed in watching Britain's national waters, defending the fishing fleets and the oil fields.
I think the Nimrod has proved itself over the last 25 years to be a very capable airframe, and that whereas the fast jet aircraft have been required to keep abreast of technology in the airframe side as well as the equipment side, the platform that we require is basically a strong, steady, reliable platform. Nimrod has shown itself to be that, and with improvements of technology with the navigation equipment, acoustic and radar equipment, we can actually fit the new equipment into the older airframe without incurring the horrendous development costs of a completely new airframe.
The threat, if you like, is still there. They still operate their submarines, and until the day they don't, then we must maintain our own defence against that type of submarine and catch up or maintain the same level of technology that they are producing.
If the price of peace is eternal vigilance, then Nimrod's future is secure. Although other enemies may appear on the international horizon, Nimrod, the mighty hunter, will be there, watching, listening, providing the eyes and ears of the RAF.
Probably the most versatile aircraft to fly with the RAF during the war, the de Havilland Mosquito succeeded in every role it was given. From its entry into service in 1941, it was used as a bomber, night fighter, pathfinder, fighter bomber, anti-shipping strike, and reconnaissance aircraft. The attributes of the Mosquito were many. At 380 miles an hour, it could evade virtually all German fighters. Mainly constructed of wood, it was very difficult to spot on radar, giving it almost a stealth capability. A service ceiling of 28,000 feet meant that it could use its oboe radar system to either bomb or mark a target accurately through cloud. But it was also a consummate low-level strike aircraft. And it could still maneuver with an agility to match many single-seat fighters. The Mosquito was the favored aircraft for many of the most hazardous operations of the war, where pinpoint accuracy was essential. These included the raids on Amiens prison, the Gestapo headquarters in The Hague, and the flying bomb sites. Almost 7,800 Mosquitoes were built, and the last examples, PR-34A reconnaissance versions, were not withdrawn until the end of 1955. The North American Mustang was the only American fighter during the Second World War to be built to a British specification. The first Marks, powered by the Allison engine, arrived in squadron service in 1942, but their impressive low-level performance was not matched at high altitudes, so they were used as reconnaissance and ground attack fighters. However, the Mark III and IV, fitted with the Merlin engines, had much superior performance at altitude of up to 42,000 feet, and with long-range tanks became the first Allied fighters able to escort bombers all the way to Germany and back. With a top speed of 442 miles an hour, Mustangs were also ideal aircraft to counter the flying bomb threat. Hundreds of the bombs were shot down over southeast England during the autumn of 1944. The Hawker Siddeley Nimrod evolved from the tried and tested Comet airliner and military transport to become Britain's foremost maritime reconnaissance aircraft since 1969. For up to 12 hours at a time, the Nimrod can stay on patrol using its EMI search-water radar system to sweep the seas for potential hostile shipping and submarines. Nimrod's key role in the Falklands War of 1982 persuaded the RAF to make some important modifications, including refueling probes, the addition of Sidewinder missiles for self-defense, and an ability to carry Harpoon air-to-surface missiles. Despite a reduction in the force in the early 1990s, the future of Nimrod is assured, with an order for new versions to be delivered early in the 21st century. The Lockheed Neptune was a long-range American bomber which was used by the RAF as a stopgap maritime reconnaissance aircraft until the arrival of Shackletons in quantity. Entering service in 1952, the Neptunes had a top speed of 353 miles an hour and a range of over 4,000 miles. The McDonnell Douglas Phantom was an American-built fighter and ground attack aircraft that was ordered by the RAF after the supersonic Harrier project was cancelled. Entering service in 1969, Phantoms were impressive aircraft with a top speed in excess of Mach 2, despite the political decision to install unsuitable Rolls-Royce Spey engines. Fitted with a look-down, shoot-down radar system and a wide range of weaponry, the Phantoms proved to be very useful aircraft until they were finally withdrawn in 1992. The North American Sabre was a swept-wing interceptor bought for the RAF in early 1953 to act as a stopgap until the Hawker Hunter entered service. For 3 years, the 700-mile-an-hour Sabres performed a vital role both in Britain and Germany at a time when East-West relations were deteriorating. The Supermarine Scarpa was a reconnaissance flying boat that entered service in 1935. As virtually a modernized version of the Southampton, the Scarpa saw active service from bases in Malta and Egypt flying protection patrols for neutral shipping during the Spanish Civil War. The last Scarpas were replaced in 1938. The SE-5A was one of the great First World War fighters, along with the Bristol fighter and the Sopwith Camel. First flown on active service in 1917, the SE-5A was probably the best aircraft to be built by the Royal Aircraft Factory and was the chosen aircraft of some of the best-known aces of the war, including Mick Mannock and Billy Bishop. The Supermarine Sea Otter was the last biplane to serve with the RAF. This air-sea rescue amphibian had greater range at 900 miles and could carry a bigger load than its predecessor, the Walrus. 141 Sea Otters, originally part of an Admiralty order, served with the RAF until the end of 1945. Following the cancellation of the airborne early warning version of the Nimrod in 1986, the RAF ordered the Boeing Sentry E-3D. The Sentry is based on the Boeing 707 airframe, and it's used to detect both low and high-flying aircraft, as well as an air command post. Entering service in 1991 and subsequently operating during the Bosnia crisis, the Sentry has added a much-needed dimension to the RAF's capabilities, being able to spend many hours on station at altitudes of up to 40,000 feet. The Avro Shackleton was the last in the line of 4-piston engine heavies produced at the Avro Works in Woodford. As a long-range maritime patrol aircraft, the Shackleton took on the mantle of the liberators of the Second World War, which had been returned to the United States in 1945. For 40 years, from 1951, it served with great distinction, and in the latter part of its life became an airborne early warning aircraft, soldiering on until the arrival of the Sentry in 1991. The mighty roar of the 4 Griffon engines became a familiar sound to the crews of Coastal Command as they spent many hours patrolling the vast waters around the coast of Britain and the Iceland-Faroes Gap. The Supermarine Southampton was a reconnaissance flying boat that served with the RAF from 1925 until 1936. In their years of service, they became famous for their long-distance flights to all the corners of the world. In 1927, 4 Southamptons left Britain on a 27,000-mile trip via the Mediterranean, India, and Hong Kong before arriving at Singapore a year later. These elegant aircraft were immensely reliable despite a modest performance, a cruising speed of no more than 85 miles an hour and a range of just under 1,000 miles.